You may not know her name, but in the weeks and months after the catastrophe of September 11, this is the woman who put the face on the crises of the Ground Zero and other nonprofit theaters. Welcome to Women in Theater. I'm Linda Weiner, theater critic and arts columnist at Newsday. And my guest today is Virginia Louloudes, who, as executive director of the Alliance of Resident Theaters, is still twisting powerful arms on behalf of the struggling theater community. Jenny, welcome.
Thank you, Linda. It's great to be here.
At what point did you realize that you were going to have to go out there and really start pushing in order to get visibility for the nonprofits?
I think there were two moments that I won't forget. One is after the second tower fell. And I knew then that the city's finances were completely and irrevocably changed. And we and many theaters were getting an incredible amount of money for projects that are capital projects, construction projects, and all of that is dependent upon the city finances being okay, and there's a clause that says it can be taken away in times of a fiscal crisis. So I thought, oh my God, all these construction projects are going to go on hold. I think about a week later, when I started to hear how many people were giving to September 11th funds, and I thought, my God, look at the power of individual giving. I realized that we needed to get the word out about off-Broadway theaters, both to the current funders to make sure that no matter what they did in supporting other groups, that they maintain their support for the theaters. And also because I realized the power of individual giving that most of us hadn't tapped.
Well, I have to tell you that sitting at home, I kept shouting at the television set every time Mayor Giuliani, who did a wonderful job during those days, absolutely, but every time he would come out and say, be patriotic, go to a Broadway show. I wanted to throw something at the television set. I wanted to say, no, what would be wrong with saying go see a cultural event, go to a nonprofit theater, go to a gallery, go to a dance concert? Because really it was so much about Broadway and money and tourism and the economy that I felt that we had really been missing the boat. And did this happen to you? Were you gritting your teeth?
I was gritting my teeth.
Yeah.
I tried to be positive and say, look at the miracle that he didn't say, go to a Yankees game.
Yeah.
You know, he said, go to the theater.
Yeah.
And I tried to be, optimistic about that. But I agree with you. And I was just telling people, buy your Christmas gifts at a museum gift shop. Buy theater tickets as Christmas presents,
Yeah.
Let's all go to theaters. So in fact, we started doing email blasts to people saying, urge your friends, particularly to go to the theaters within blocks of Ground Zero, once they were able to have audiences come to them a month later.
Do you have a sense that anybody did?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, it was wonderful. I remember going to see Sick in previews at Soho Rep, and people were there and they whispered to me, I don't know what you did, but we're sold out tonight. It was great. It was just great.
Certainly the 9/11 created crisis for everyone. How do you justify begging for the arts? And I use that word, it's just that there's so many, the whole cliche about the starving artist, and we're always asking for money. And at this point, what impressed me so much about everything that I saw you doing in the last year and more than a year now, that I would watch you actually define the needs in a way that's so concrete, that didn't have any of the same kind of we're begging for money, support poor us quality to it. How did you do it?
I'm blessed that I represent 400 companies that employ some of the most creative and hopeful people. Yesterday, for example, I had 13 people in a room who were just told by a funder, next year we're not going to be able to give you as much money as we're giving this year. And I said to them, to get the discussion going, do you think the theater's going as well as the front page story of a major newspaper this week indicated? And I thought they were going to say, no, things are terrible. And they said, most of us started out in 1990 during the recession. We are going to do our shows no matter what. We believe in theater. We love what we do. We'll make it happen. If we have to do one less show, we'll do one less show. So they don't feel sorry for themselves. So how dare I go out there and feel sorry for them? And secondly, I think more to the point of what you're asking, one of the things that I think is incumbent upon us at Art New York is to have statistics. I mean, that was literally in our founding mission statement, that our purview was to have statistics for the media. So right after September 11th, we had a mechanism in place where we could email and broadcast, fax a survey to everyone just to quantify the losses.
Yeah, I know immediately that I was able to use, as a journalist, I was able to fall back on, oh, no, it may look as if everything is fine, but after all, the nonprofit theaters are going to have, I forget, $16 million projected loss.
Right, and about $5 million direct.
Yeah, so I know that I was really happy to have those numbers. And Art New York, what does it do besides save people in crisis?
Well, I could answer by saying that, you know, when there isn't a crisis in theaters, nothing's happening.
Then there is a crisis.
But there's always a challenge. And I think, and you know, I have a tough time putting in 2 sentences what we do, and I have to find a way to do that for a variety of reasons. But our basic mission is to find out what are the challenges and opportunities in the field and to respond. And I think where we've gotten very good is that we respond quickly. So what's interesting about my job is that one year the challenge is real estate, and we have the wherewithal to buy a building and provide affordable office and rehearsal space
Which
for
you just
theaters.
did, right?
We did that in Brooklyn in 2000,
Yeah.
and we're opening a space in Manhattan. It's almost fully occupied now, and it'll be completely occupied in 3 weeks.
You see, nobody talks about growth like that in the nonprofits now. That's what's so impressive.
And it's actually growth to help them in shrinking budget times. You know, my theory is if we can't help theaters raise their revenue, then it's our job to help them cut their expenses. So by combining theaters and sharing a net lease and sharing things like the cost of a conference room and restrooms and a kitchen and a Xerox machine, which you're barely utilizing individually, then you can amortize those costs and get and bring your costs down. At the same time, if 20 groups go to a landlord and say, we want 32,000 square feet for 20 years, as opposed to 20 groups going individually and saying we want a 5 or 10 year lease for 100 square feet or 500 square feet or 3,500 square feet, you're going to get better terms if you go together with one big, massive request. So the idea actually came to me in this building 2 years ago in this very building where we're recording at the CUNY Broadcast Center. The Arts and Business Council had a workshop, a panel discussion on the space crisis, and I just thought out loud and said, we need to create a Costco for real estate. You know how you buy at Costco and it's cheaper because you buy a lot? We need to buy leases in bulk. And a person on the panel said to me, if you're serious about this, I'm going to show you space. And we worked together before, and the next day he showed me space. And
was that the Fort Greene?
It was, no, we had already opened the Fort Greene space. He showed me 528th Avenue.
Yeah, in the Garment District.
In the Garment District, and I looked at this floor and I went, oh my God, this is fabulous.
Then how many groups do you have functioning out of there? 24
groups will be at 528th Avenue by November 15th. 20 groups are in South Oxford space. So together the 2 spaces have 11% of our membership housed in facilities that we either own or rent.
Which is so important because what we always say about, you know, how can you continue to have seedlings growing, because you really don't know when you toss out help to a lot of young people. You don't know which one's going to grow up to be David Mamet and Arthur Miller and Tony Kushner, even better than David Mamet. So, but you knew there was trouble in the economy before 9/11.
Absolutely. My phone was ringing. After we opened our space in Brooklyn, which was in March of 2001, March of 2000, I would get a call a week almost from a group saying, is there any more space in the Brooklyn building? Is there any more space in the Brooklyn building? And I finally realized we need to do another one. It probably should be in Manhattan. Yeah. And so we pursued this. And we really didn't have to push hard to get it occupied. It was basically filled, 80% of it was filled by word of mouth. People saying, oh, I hear you've got this space and my lease is coming up. And we were very fortunate that the city of New York committed $2.5 million to that floor. They took $500,000 away after September 11th, and then this June they restored it. So we've been truly blessed. The build-out was completely paid for by the city.
Now, when in the 90s, I think, as I understand it, the problem with corporate giving was that so many of the corporations were combining, so you had fewer sources of income. But now so many of them are failing, and there's so much trouble. So people, I know that in the music world, there's real panic because a major donor, Albert Villar, is in big financial trouble. But are you having that kind of, Enron crash, that the poor people in Texas are having. All the arts groups in Texas are going, oh
It's
no,
horrible. No,
oh no,
when
not
you all,
Enron.
if you depend upon one source of revenue,
Yeah.
it is horrible. And I think in the theater community, and first of all, we represent theaters who are so diverse. We represent the two largest theaters in the country, not the two largest not-for-profits, Roundabout and Lincoln Center Theater, and we represent 200 of the smallest theaters in the country whose budgets are under $100,000 a year. So there's a huge diversity in the kind of work they do, their budgets, et cetera.
And in the first 10 years that you've been executive director, then it went from 150 groups
Right.
to now 400.
And
so
many
it's
of them came
overwhelming.
about during the recession. We were looking at this amazed,
Yeah.
saying, what would make somebody say, gee, there's a recession, the NEA's been slashed, the NISCA budget's been slashed, the city's not giving as much, I'm going to start a theater in New York City. You know, it didn't make sense. But then, as one of our special advisors and consultants, George Thorne, said to me, people don't create theaters because the economics make sense. They create theaters because that's what they have to do. So the people that we serve, those 260 theaters who we call small, in other words, their budgets are under 150,000, these are people who have to do theater, and many of them have survival jobs, but they do amazing work. And some of them, the Signature Theater had a budget of $100,000 11 years ago. Look at them today, their budget's I think $2.5 million. They have a commercial, a show running off Broadway and an extended run with Ed Norton. They have grown by leaps and bounds. You can't predict. I mean, we knew they were going to go somewhere because they were strong from the beginning and they had an easily identified mission. But as you said, you never know which one is going to come up with the next Pulitzer Prize winning playwright or award-winning director. And that's what's fun to see. That's what's
And
really
your
fun to
400
see.
theaters are in the 5 boroughs?
In the 5 boroughs. I have to say they're mostly in Manhattan, but they're in all 5 boroughs. And they're all kinds of theaters. And what we're also seeing is that the whole genre is changing.
How so?
You're seeing a lot more movement-based work, less linear plays, less what we call kitchen sink dramas, a lot of dance and music done by the performers.
Why do you think that is?
That's a great question. I think it's basically a reaction to society, and I think people are expressing themselves differently. I think people who are writing these plays and composing them are not watching sitcoms and saying, I'm going to make that into a play. They're talking about a personal experience. We're living in a postmodern age. God knows the last year has been almost biblical in what we've gone through. And I think their response is very primal. So just as early tribes, the first Greek theaters were singing and it was religious experiences, these people are dancing or they're moving or they're singing. And they're not thinking about, am I an actor, singer, singer, actor? You know, I only do one thing. These are artists who've been trained at some of our best acting programs and they've had wonderful training and they're gifted.
Does this in some ways remind you of the beginning of the off-Broadway theater movement, which of course is what your organization began representing, but that kind of downtown people experimenting much more with the form and with their bodies and with language and tossing literalism out the window a little bit. And it sounds to me that what you're describing is similar to that.
Absolutely, and what's really wonderful is to see how many of these companies have been mentored by a Richard Foreman, for example. David Herskovitz, who runs Target Margins, a protege of Richard Foreman. We have a company called Collision Theory that has been trained by Beatrice Leeds, who's of the Spolin-Sills method. So definitely, the people who created Off-Broadway in the 60s, they have been mentoring groups that are now coming of age.
And do you think part of the reason Off-Broadway began was as a reaction because Off-Broadway had become so commercial in that it was almost indistinguishable from Broadway? And in some ways, the last 10 years, we could say that happening again.
We can't see it happening again. And I often tell people that many of the things that I see, particularly downtown, would never, ever work on a Broadway stage. It's just not proscenium. It's not made for a large audience. You know, there was a show based on the history of the Judson Poets Center where they actually had you go there and there'd be 10 people in a room. You can't move that, no matter how powerful it is, to a Broadway venue. It just doesn't work. So I agree with you. It is done not as much in reaction to Broadway as I think the sensibilities of what they're writing about is a very unique experience, and it's not met for a broad-based audience either. You know, their target market is much smaller and more particular than something like a Broadway musical or a
But
revival.
do you see Off-Broadway becoming more commercial and a little bit safer? Is this because of the economy?
I think it's certainly all of us, and I would say my off-Broadway people as well, have to become we have to think about a market sensibility. Because as contributions drop, and they will with the economy, the only thing we can be sure of is that when the curtain goes up, we can sell tickets. Now, maybe we won't, but we can sell tickets. So we have to provide something that people want to see. I think there's been a misperception that people think that people want to see light entertainment. Yeah. When we looked at, we've just been analyzing data, finding out how people ended the year last year. What did you think your budget was going to be on September 10th? How did you revise your budget after the 11th? And how did you end the year? Mm-hmm. Here's the remarkable thing. Manhattan Class Company's strongest play was a play called The Glory of Living by Rebecca Gilman. Now, granted, Anna Paquin was in it.
You had a movie star in it.
But it was a dark play.
Yeah.
Tony Kushner's play, Homebody Kabul, was a huge success for New York Theater Workshop. Granted, that's a celebrity writer, but this was a play that they were worried about what will the audience reaction be, and will people come, because it was sympathetic to, it was giving you an Afghan sensibility as well as a Western sensibility. It was showing you both sides, and they were very, very good about the way they presented it and how they positioned it, but they were concerned. I think people in times like what we're going through right now, I think after September 11th in particular, the big question, whether you were my 4-year-old son at the time or a 55-year-old person, you want to ask yourself, how can this happen? Who would do this? And you go back to those classic Greek tragedies, or you go and write your own tragedy because you're thinking about what would inspire something dark and evil. So it's not necessarily going to be the musical that you produce.
It's not going to be Hairspray. It doesn't need to be Hairspray.
Right,
then,
and we found that many of our members' dark plays were the ones that attracted the audience because they wanted to really sit in a room and contemplate. And they weren't saying entertain me, they were saying I want to explore how this world is operating and how this can happen.
Now, you've been in the biz in different positions for at least several decades. Now, if you look at what the crises and the challenges were in the 90s compared to the challenges in the 80s, compared to the challenges we have today, I mean, at each time, didn't you think, oh my God, we're in a catastrophe? We have to get out of this, and then and how are they different? Could you give me a little overview?
Yeah, I would have to say that I was naive enough in the 80s to not know that there was a problem, and I was working at 3 large theaters at the time.
Manhattan
Theater Club. I worked at the Huntington Theater in Boston, and then came back to New York and worked at the Roundabout. So I was doing marketing. My realization at the Roundabout of the crisis of the 90s was that there had been funding cuts to the State Arts Council, and we had to raise $100,000 at Roundabout between, I believe it was March and the end of August.
And this was in
1991.
Ooh.
And we did a raffle.
Ooh, late George Bush the First.
Right.
Not a good time for the arts.
Right. And how are we going to do this? And I said, why don't we have a raffle? And we went and sold raffle tickets to the audience and made the money. Not everybody had that opportunity, but that was something we did. So that's how I knew there was a fiscal crisis. And I also knew that it was harder to sell subscriptions. As the person in charge of that, it was really hard to get people to commit to a subscription. When I got to Art New York and I was able to see the world from a view of all the theaters and see how the funding was dropping and saw the dependence that the theaters had on government sources, the NEA, the State Arts Council in particular in the city, it was revealed that we needed to expand and diversify. We needed to find other sources of revenue. The big theaters had done that, the mid-size and the smalls hadn't. And that has been done. God knows we have been saying diversification, expand your earned income base, blah, blah, blah. If there's any fat, my God, and there wasn't much off Broadway, it has been completely cut to the bone. So now the challenge is, now what do we do? Because now I think most companies are very lean, and many of these small companies are more like ensemble dance companies than your traditional not-for-profit resident theater with a managing director, an artistic director, and all these different business staffs. So where do you cut? And that's where I think of shared resources, sharing office space.
That's what you're doing there.
And I also think it's about better marketing. I think, we also noticed after September 11th, the ticket buying habits changed. It went from advanced planning to spur of the moment.
And that had already begun, right? I mean,
Broadway noticed that first.
That the subscribers and the advanced ticket buyers
Right.
had already changed. They had already changed the behavior. It seemed the behavior was changing.
I think
but
it's
then
been-
after 9/11, it really
Right.
became quite
Yes.
critical, right?
I think there's two things that are happening. I think there's been a resistance to subscription for quite some time because our lives have gotten more complicated, and there's a sense that you don't want to program yourself. On the other hand, I just filled out my first subscription because if I don't program myself, then I can't get the sitter and all of those things. But last year, I will say, as somebody who lived in Brooklyn, because of the irregularity in the beginning of the subway system and not knowing what color the alert was going to be, I would only plan to go out at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I would say, you know what, I think I can handle it tonight. I feel rested enough that I can stay up late to sit through a play and get home late. And the transportation is working today. So I was one of those spur-of-the-moment people.
Now, your degree is in arts management
Right.
from American University. Who's Ginny Louloudes? Everyone in the arts community knows Ginny Louloudes, but where did you come from?
I came from Bridgeport, Connecticut, the home of P.T. Barnum.
And you
There was no
you
theater
didn't-
in the town.
And you didn't want to get on the stage and put on grease paint? You wanted to run things?
I actually, it was the weird thing about Bridgeport, Connecticut was we had very good community theater, and the high school that was built in the 60s had a black box theater, which is kind of odd since there was no professional theater to sort of feed this. And we had a black box theater, and we had a very strong theater
And
program.
did you perform?
I performed. I did a lot of choreography and dance. And then when it came time to look at college, there was a part of me that knew I didn't have the strength to go to auditions and constantly have to put myself up for
Such a life,
rejection.
isn't it?
I just couldn't do it. So I, in typical Ginny fashion, did the radical thing and went to a school that had no theater program. So I went to Johns Hopkins for undergraduate, thinking there's no theater, I won't be tempted to do theater. And then, of course, I found out that they had a volunteer theater program for people who weren't theater majors. But my first semester, I was like, no, I'm just going to study. And my grades were horrible, and I wasn't happy. And so I finally said, you know what? If my grades are going to be horrible, I might as well be happy. So I'll do theater. And, lo and behold, my grades went up because I had structure. I had to be ready for this to go to rehearsal. And I was happier. And Hopkins was a great place, I tell people, to do marketing the arts because my job was to get people not to study. I'd get the pre-meds out of the library and come and see a show or come to rehearsal if they're in a show. So it was great training in a lot of ways. And then that was when all the arts management programs around the country kind of opened up. And I wanted to be in a major city where there were lots of art things to choose from. I was very intimidated about New York, so I didn't seriously consider coming to New York. So I went to American. And it was a great place. It was very strong in marketing, and that's what I ended up doing.
Now, here's a tricky question. There's only been 3 directors of Art New York since its beginning.
No, more than that.
Oh, really?
Ginny Kahn was the founder, so there have been 2 Ginnies.
Yeah.
Then there was Nancy Heller,
Jane Moss?
Jane Moss, Ellen Rudolph is 4, Kate Bush is 5.
Okay, but here's my point then.
Okay.
Here's my point. My point is even better now. Okay, all women.
Right,
We're women in theater.
right.
All women. Is there something nurturing about what you do?
Absolutely. And funny, because I was going to answer yes before you gave the question, because I thought, yes, we're nurturers. And in fact, we got a special Obie last May, and Elisa Solomon wrote the presentation, which is on the cover of our annual report this year, and she uses the word for nurturing 400 theaters, large and small. She uses the word nurturing. Yes, I think there's something in women that is nurturing, and I think, the feminist part of me didn't want to acknowledge that in the beginning, and now that I have had a child and I realize that it is part of who we are, and there are men who are nurturing too in this business. I've been mentored by a number of men who've been tremendously giving. I think it's interesting that it's always been women running Art New York, and there have been different types of women. I wouldn't say it's the same personality either. I think the personality matched what the dominant sector was going through. So I always, you know, Jane Moss came out of Playwrights Horizons, and they were one of the large theater members. And the strength of Art New York during her tenure was getting those theaters from a mid-sized budget level to where they are today by institutionalizing them and getting them first computers in theaters was something Jane did.
But is this something that, when you look at the number of women playwrights who are not being produced, and the women directors who are not getting work, and here's an area that really does seem to be welcoming to women, and not just for the nurturing, but also for the organizing, and it's impressive to me.
Well, thanks. I think it's also because we have if you look at the jobs in administration, women development directors, women marketing directors, very few women are finance directors. Just now are you seeing, or in the last 10 years, women general managers and managing directors. So it's that kind of skill that you use in a service organization.
And don't you ever think, why do you not want to work this hard on commercial theater and get rich?
I feel very rich. No, I don't want to work in commercial theater. I love what I do, and it's all about who I serve. And so I feel very rich because I work for people who say thank you.
One last question. If, as a woman, there were one thing that you could do to change the theater world as it is right now, what would that be?
It would be making it possible for more and more people in the not-for-profit theater world, particularly the smaller theaters, to be in this business and have a great life and have health insurance and feel that they could have a family and not have to leave this field or go to a larger not-for-profit because now they're supporting one or two kids.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. On behalf of the League of Professional Theater Women, I'm Linda Weiner, and this is Women in Theater.